All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that impacts, well, pretty much every single one of us at some point in our careers, but honestly, it's something very few people actually understand from a scientific standpoint. We're talking about performance measurement. I'm going to walk you through the fascinating and honestly surprisingly rigorous science of exactly how human workplace behavior is calculated, quantified, and ultimately graded. So, think about your last performance review for a second. Have you ever walked out of that meeting and just kind of wondered, was that score actually accurate? Like, did that questionnaire they used truly capture all your hard work? Or was it basically just an arbitrary set of checkboxes? Well, behind those everyday corporate surveys and rating scales is a massive field of academic study. Today, we're putting your performance review right under the microscope to see how it's actually built. Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Reliability versus validity. 2. Building psychometric scales. 3. Three approaches to performance. And 4. Comparative versus absolute measurement. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, reliability and validity. Before your boss can even think about evaluating you, their grading system actually has to pass two incredibly strict mathematical prerequisites. Those are reliability and validity. Now, reliability just means, does this measure give you consistent results over and over again? Validity, on the other hand, means, is this measure actually capturing what it's supposed to be measuring? And here is the absolute golden rule you've got to remember. Reliability is a strict prerequisite for validity. Basically, if a measure doesn't correlate with itself consistently, it literally cannot correlate with anything else. To put this into perspective, think about this brilliant clock analogy from Cook's 1998 research. Imagine a broken clock, and its hands are permanently stuck at 5 minutes to 12. Every single time you look at that clock, it says 5 to 12. So it's highly reliable, right? It's perfectly consistent. But unless it happens to actually be 5 to 12 in the real world at that exact second, that clock is completely invalid for telling the actual time. So the big takeaway here is that a reliable measure is not automatically a valid one. You absolutely need both for true scientific measurement.
All right, let's move into Section 2, building psychometric scales.
So now that we know we need reliability and validity, how do they actually engineer those rating scales that show up on your performance review? Well, to build a valid survey, you really have to understand something called psychological space. This is a concept pioneered by Thurstone way back in 1929. Think about when you look at a scale ranging from strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. The mental gap, or the interval, between disagree and neutral has to equal the exact same mathematical gap between neutral and agree. They have to be what's called equally appearing intervals. Because if the psychological distance between the options isn't perfectly even, the entire mathematical foundation of the survey basically starts to crumble. And because of this need for equal psychological space, there are some pretty strict rules for scale building. For example, you absolutely have to use true antonyms for the opposite ends of the scale. And the anchors, the actual labels on the buttons you click, have to steadily increase in size from left to right. It sounds super simple, but you'd be shocked at how often common workplace surveys completely violate this rule. Take a scale that goes from not at all, to a little, to neutral, to a lot, and then extremely. Not at all and extremely are actually not perfect opposites. Getting this true scientific measurement right is frankly surprisingly challenging. There's another hurdle here too. A single survey question only gives you what we call discrete data. So if you have a 1 to 5 scale, you can only score a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. You can't pick 3.14, right? But to get the precise, continuous data that they need to truly rank your overall performance, and let's be real, possibly determine your year-end bonus, statisticians actually have to group several related items together and then calculate the mean of a participant's responses across all of those items. But wait, how do we know if all those different questions are actually measuring the exact same thing? Well, let's say we have 3 different questions about how well an employee listens to customers. Statisticians use a reliability coefficient called Cronbach's alpha. Basically, they want this alpha score to be above 0.75. If it is, it mathematically proves that the multiple survey items are successfully clinging together to measure the exact same underlying construct. But if that alpha score is too low, the math literally proves the survey is flawed and they have to throw those questions right out. Moving right along to Section 3, 3 approaches to performance. Okay, so now that we understand the granular math behind the survey questions themselves, let's zoom out to the macro level. How are these measurement tools actually applied to evaluating you in the real world? Well, there's this brilliant model adapted by Aquinas that breaks job performance down into 3 interconnected phases. First up, you have an employee's underlying traits, so their raw characteristics and knowledge. In a given work situation, those traits drive the employee to engage in specific behaviors. And finally, those behaviors produce measurable results. Whenever a company wants to measure your performance, they first have to decide which of these 3 distinct areas they are actually going to target. Let's ground this theory with a super concrete example: a sales executive. If an organization decides they're going to measure the results phase of a sales exec, they're not looking at their personality traits or how politely they speak to clients. Not at all. They use strictly objective numerical metrics. We're talking hard numbers, things like raw sales volume, annual sales growth percentages, market share, and product breadth. These objective numbers are what determine the individual's performance grade, completely separate from any behavioral ratings. And that brings us to Section 4, Comparative versus Absolute Measurement. This is where we get into the absolute most intense, highest stakes part of HR, ranking the workforce. When grading performance, companies generally have to choose between 2 totally distinct philosophies. First, you have an absolute system. This compares an employee against a fixed objective standard. If you meet that standard, you get a good grade, period, regardless of anyone else. But then you have a comparative system. This evaluates an employee strictly based on the person sitting next to them. In this system, you are quite literally graded against your peers. Now, one of the most famous and definitely the most talked about comparative systems in the corporate world is a forced distribution model. You've probably heard it called rank and yank. In this model, an organization basically mandates that their entire workforce must be sorted into specific percentage buckets based on those comparative performance scores. The mechanics of this system are pretty straightforward, but obviously highly impactful. Employees are ranked from top to bottom. The top 20% of performers are identified and highly rewarded. The middle 70% are retained and partially rewarded. And then the bottom 10% of performers are fundamentally forced to leave the organization, that is the yank in rank and yank, and they are subsequently replaced by new recruits. It is a highly competitive framework for sure. And interestingly, research shows it's actually utilized by around 20% of Fortune 500 organizations. You might be wondering, how does a system like this affect a company over time? Well, researchers Mulligan and Bullshaffer actually ran computer simulations to see what happens to a company's workforce performance potential when they use these forced distribution models. And their data suggests something fascinating. Over a long timeline, maintaining a strict 10% turnover rate, meaning continually replacing that bottom tier, actually yields the highest performance potential for the organization as a whole when compared to other turnover thresholds. Before we wrap up, I want to share this incredible final insight from Aquinas and O'Boyle that really challenges how we think about the workplace. For the longest time, HR just assumed that employee performance looked like a standard bell curve, but recent science suggests that job performance often follows what's called a power law distribution. This means it defies normal distributions entirely. In reality, a very small number of star performers at the very top contribute exponentially more to an organization than everyone else combined. The sheer scale of their output is just massive. So there you have it. We've gone from the highly granular math of psychological spacing and Cronbach's alpha all the way up to massive corporate force distributions. The science of human measurement is incredibly deep, like a giant puzzle. I want to leave you with this question. When you look back at your own performance reviews, which system is your workplace actually using? Are they measuring your traits, your behaviors, or your results? Are you being graded on an absolute scale, or are you just being compared to the person sitting next to you? And most importantly, is their math truly capturing your real performance? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember, keep asking the right questions.